Hello everyone, welcome to Asian Pacific Shows. In this episode today, we are going to talk about one of the China's grand strategy, Belt and Road Initiative, and one of its most important component, Maritime Silk Road Initiative. As a geographical space, we will evaluate our topics within the framework of the Indo-Pacific region. Our title is Belt and Road and Maritime Silk Road in Indo-Pacific. My guest is Dr. Benjamin Barton. Dr. Benjamin Barton is an assistant professor in the School of Politics, History and International Relations at the University of Nottingham Malaysia. Dr. Barton graduated in 2016 from a joint PhD program between King's College London and Hong Kong University. Prior to undertaking his doctoral degree, Dr. Barton was a research assistant for the College of Europe's Chair of the China Relations. Dr. Barton's research focuses on Chinese foreign policy, particularly Chinese economic statecraft as expressed via the Belt and Road Initiative and Maritime Silk Road, Chinese security policy pertaining to its relations to the African continent, South Asia, and Central Asia, as well as its bilateral relations with the European Union. Welcome, Benjamin. Thank you for joining me and my shows today.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, Lokman. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you very much. Benjamin, now, as our topic, we are going to start and discuss on. Can you tell us, please, where does the BRA and MSRI fit into the Chinese grand strategy for the Indo-Pacific region? How do commercial and interests intersect in this context?
Right. So the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road Initiative essentially play the part of the, let's say, the appealing dimension to China's grand strategy of push and pull in the Indo-Pacific. So if we go back to the very origins of the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, back to 2013, when Xi Jinping announced its launch, effectively, in front of the parliament in Jakarta, the Maritime Silk Road Initiative was designed originally for ASEAN countries. And this design was effectively to mitigate some of the criticism which China had been receiving that under Xi, but also before Xi, that China had been acting aggressively with regards to the South China Sea. And so in a way to show and prove to its neighbors that China was not just pertained to aggressive intent, it also designed this Maritime Silk Road Initiative in a way to assuage some of the fears of the countries in this particular region. But then, of course, as we know, since both the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road Initiative in the various corridors on land and at sea has been rolled out pretty much to include all of the rest of the world, with the exception of North America and the two poles. So effectively, this has always played a part of utilizing and meeting the commercial and developmental needs of countries, first of all in Southeast Asia, but then spreading out to other parts of the developing world, in a way to provide the sway needed for those countries to accept China's rise to a certain extent. So there's two dimensions. There's one is using trade and investment to reassure these countries that China's intentions are nefarious. But I think that there's also a kind of, this is the grand strategy and bigger picture dimension, is to utilize, to exploit this trade and investment dimension towards a greater political end. And I think that is for China to lean upon developing countries and get their support in order to legitimize China's eventual rise towards becoming, first of all, a regional hegemon in Asia, and then perhaps further down the road, a global hegemon as well.
So, Benjamin, you mentioned very important things. You said first this project started as a regional project.
Yeah.
Not a global project.
No. So the initial scope of the MSRI, the maritime dimension,
Yes.
was really designed for ASEAN countries. It was essentially to reassure them that China's behavior in the South China Sea did not characterize China's entire approach towards Southeast Asia. And this, in a way, goes back to the treaty of friendship that China entertains with Southeast Asia as a region back in 2003, so it's a similar kind of push and pull. Push in terms of trying to build up the artificial reefs in the South China Sea, in terms of the more aggressive or bullying attitude which China adopts in that part of the world, with this kind of pull factor of drawing these countries towards China, reassuring them that China isn't just acting aggressively, but in a way helping them to become even more dependent on China, whether through trade and investment. So that's the first element, but it was originally designed for Southeast Asia. The other thing is that both the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road Initiative rely upon something which already existed. So China was already a world leader in investments, in infrastructure development, whether building roads, condos, stadiums, bridges, you name it, from about the turn of the 21st century onwards. And that mostly in the developing world. So predominantly in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, in Southeast Asia as well. So what Xi Jinping was doing in devising the BRI and the MSRI is simply leaning upon, a comparative advantage which Chinese companies have in the infrastructure domain, and utilizing that for strategic purposes. But yes, indeed, it was originally designed for ASEAN and Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia. Very interesting. Why, Benjamin, why have emerging low-income countries that make up the Indo-Pacific been drawn to the MSRI or BRA?
Well, effectively because they are, like, in the predicament of most developing countries, in need of infrastructure investments. So whether they're emerging economies like the country we're both in right now, Malaysia, or whether they're low-income countries, let's take the example of Bangladesh in the Indo-Pacific or in the Indian Ocean region. These are countries which require substantial amounts of financing, either to build new infrastructure or simply to renovate existing infrastructure to cope with their changing developmental status. And so there have been many reports published over the years that there's an infrastructure financing gap. And that's hurting particularly countries such as Malaysia, which are middle-income countries seeking to escape the middle-income trap and become fully industrialized countries as well. But the issue is that there aren't that many players in the infrastructure scene which can provide the kind of financing that countries can aspire to through the Belt and Road Initiative. And not just the financing, but also China's own expertise when it comes to building infrastructure and utilizing that to form a basis for enhanced economic growth. Chinese state-owned companies which are specialized in infrastructure, Chinese laborers who constitute a rather large pool of labor resources and can be shifted from one country to the next, and usually work in relatively unfavorable conditions, but basically will take the work or obliged to take the work. And also the materials needed in infrastructure construction often are cheaper to source from China. So in a way, you've got this kind of package which countries can sign up to, where in return they will have infrastructure which will be built relatively fast with the financing which is quite competitive. And in the cases of countries, particularly low-income countries who are already saddled with historical debt, a debt legacy. If I take Djibouti, again, this time from the far western sector of the Indo-Pacific, this is a very small country with few natural resources, which had historically a difficult time getting financing, either from France, its former colonial power, from other Western actors, whether countries or multilateral banks. And so then, like many a low-income country, turned to China and these Chinese state-owned companies because they could offer the quick financing and the quick construction needed to allow many of these countries to actually then aspire to, improve their economic situation, at least in terms of the actual physical development needed. So that's, in a way, why the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, took off as it has, not just because China really provided the resources behind it, but because clearly there was a demand amongst countries in the developing world, many of whom are situated in the Indo-Pacific, who needed that kind of a model. And one important point to bring up here is indeed the role of the leaders of these countries. So if we take Sri Lanka or Malaysia, sorry, or even Maldives, actually, their leaders at various different times were the ones who were pushing for the construction of various infrastructure projects, which will later fall under the aegis of the Belt and Road Initiative or the Maritime Silk Road Initiative. So in 2014, you've got the re-election of Mahindra Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka. Mahindra Rajapaksa has built up a relatively strong relationship with the China port merchants over the past decade before that, and he's leaning on them to build the kind of projects which will help him, he thinks, get re-elected. So that's why you've got the Hambantota port, the Hambantota International Airport, which have been decried as white elephants since. But he saw that as necessary for his re-election campaign. The same thing in Malaysia with the former Prime Minister Najib, who signed up to a whole raft of BRI projects, again, because he believed that this would be necessary to push for this process of modernization, which would then be appealed to the electorate and it would allow him to stay in power. In the context of an authoritarian country, in Djibouti, it's not too dissimilar, because the leader, Gele, wants to modernize the country so that he can stay in power as well. So that he needs to have those people, those companies, that financing, which can then help him in his own political aspirations. So that's, I think, a relatively understated component of the entire Belt and Road Initiative. It's the role played by the individual leaders, political leaders of the various countries who signed up to a memorandum of understanding. And that's because they had a specific need, which the BRI could provide to help satisfy their political demands.
Benjamin, in this aspect, at the same time, can we say China emerged as an alternative power? As you mentioned, you say the Djibouti example.
Yeah.
Previously, maybe a few years ago, Djibouti wasn't able to find an alternative found, but now China can offer, and for other countries also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, when you provide that amount of financing, when you provide that kind of political capital for these leaders, whether they're autocrats or whether they're democratically elected, that translates it necessarily into influence. And I know that in the literature on which looks at particularly the role of state-owned enterprises, Chinese state-owned enterprises overseas, sometimes the literature will find quite convincing examples to say, well, these state-owned enterprises, although they might be state-owned in part, they don't always play along exactly with the objectives of the government, okay? But it's difficult to disassociate some of these companies from a kind of broader state vision as well. I mean, particularly that members of the party often will sit on the boards, and play perhaps a bit more of a proactive role than we would like to imagine. So, of course, this is intrinsically tied to China's ability to garner power. That being said, this power can also be sometimes surprisingly or catch, I think, China slightly off guard sometimes, because if you take the case of Mahindra Rajapaksa, he was definitely China's favored candidate because Sri Lanka had very good relations with China under his leadership as prime minister. In fact, he went to the extent of kind of putting China first above India, which for Sri Lanka is a big deal because of the kind of intrinsic relationship that the two parties have. And China was convinced, I believe, that he would be re-elected also thanks to these various Maritime Silk Road Initiative projects. But he lost the election. In fact, his rapprochement with China went against him because the following prime minister who was running against him in that election, Sirisena, used an anti-China ticket, if you like, to get himself elected. So he criticized some of these deals, and he got the support of civil society, which was not happy with some of the terms of those particular deals. And the same thing happened in the Maldives in 2018 under the former president Yamin. Maldives had drifted, I think, quite considerably into China's sphere of influence because China was providing the financing, because Xi Jinping had visited Maldives, because Chinese tourists had become, a really important market for a country which depends on tourism so much. So, of course, this necessarily translates into a form of influence. But in 2018, Ibrahim Soleh ran against Yamin, again on a similar anti-China ticket, and he won. And there are kind of sporadic examples, across the global south, where, in countries like Zambia, Chinese investments are primordial for the well-being of the country's economy. But sometimes, the leaders, the opposition leaders, they will, castigate China as a way to get elected. And although they might tone down their criticism when they eventually themselves become elected, like Sirisena in Sri Lanka, it doesn't, I think it doesn't help to have a prime minister or a president who's been critical of China then become, take over power, if you like. So I think that this is the big debate which has gone on in the literature and in commentary with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative is, has it necessarily translated into an increase in Chinese influence? And I mean, of course, it'd be disingenuous for me to say no. I think it has, obviously, and that's normal because China provides such largesse, and that translates into various forms of influence or network power, soft power, physical power, which can be in a way translated into a form of soft power as well, with all this infrastructure being built by Chinese companies. I think that gives out a certain image of power, if you like. But is that are we able to kind of have a kind of finite and absolute conclusion with regards to that connection between the BRI and China's increase in power? I think there's still it's still a moving target, so it's difficult to say for certain whether that connection is really working out in that regard.
So I will ask another thing. What has been the strategic commission regarding the Maritime Silk Road's reload into the Indo-Pacific, and why? What is the actual state of affairs on the ground at sea?
Okay, so you mean in terms of the strategic China's grand strategic plans?
Yes.
Okay, so what's the evolution? Okay, so right now the question is, will China be able to maintain its level of financing? And so there are debates ongoing about this. First of all, in China, the amount of spending on the BRI and Maritime Silk Road Initiative has been criticized because by ordinary citizens in China, some of whom just simply do not understand why the government would finance and bankroll such lavish projects overseas when maybe the money should be spent better be spent domestically. I think that the Chinese government is aware of that criticism. There's also been fears that the money has been poorly spent in some instances. So projects which have not necessarily worked out as they were supposed to. There's been criticism in China and outside of China with regards to financing, issues pertaining to debt traps, but more in terms of some of the projects themselves. I think that they've been considered maybe not as effective as they were originally planned to be. So there's, I think, a bit more of a conservative streak amongst Chinese policy banks like the Exim Bank, the China Development Bank, who finance these kind of projects. I think that they are not as they're not so willing to take as many risks as they did perhaps 5 years ago. The Chinese economy is slowing down as well, so that's another consideration. And of course, with COVID-19, the government has to perhaps reconsider some of its spending, and that might have a kind of knock-on impact, knock-on effect on the ability to finance the Maritime Silk Road Initiative. Now, the COVID-19, of course, also hit the supply chains and the ability of some of these projects to continue. Now, according to various reports across the MSRI, the projects which were under construction are now picking up. So I think that issue is kind of slowly sorting itself out. Now, how is that translated in kind of strategic terms as of 2021? If I focus here predominantly on the Indian Ocean component of the Indo-Pacific, because that's where the majority of MSRI projects have been rolled out. Well, obviously, China's influence is there. To kind of go back to your previous question, there's a number of projects ongoing. You can cite Malaysia, you can cite Thailand, you can cite Bangladesh, you can cite Pakistan, of course, with CPEC and the port of Karachi, and you can spread that out as far as Djibouti, Kenya, and well, Tanzania, perhaps. Now, commercially, I think we still are waiting to see whether these ports will actually be finalized. Some of them are already up and running, others are not. So if we take a kind of big picture perspective, it's not at all complete as we would like to imagine it would be. And then in terms of the strategic value of these ports, this is where there's been some discussion in the literature and again in commentary about whether China, particularly in India, this discussion has been quite prominent, about whether China is actually seeking to build something akin to the string of pearls concept, which was devised back in 2006. Whether the Maritime Silk Road is actually a kind of reincarnation of the string of pearls. So that would mean that all of these ports around the kind of Indian Ocean basin, so Chittagong in Bangladesh, Karachi in Pakistan, Djibouti, Lamu in Kenya, Bagamoyo in Tanzania, would come together to form a kind of a network which would then allow some form of encirclement of India in the Indian Ocean, which India considers to be its own kind of strategic backyard. Now, the empirical evidence as of 2021 is not convincing at all. Why? Because, as I mentioned, there's only a handful of projects which have actually come to termination. Others are still in the process of being constructed. And in any case, if you look at the specifics of some of these deals, often they involve more than just China. They involve actors from other countries, and it would be quite superficial to make the conclusion that just because China or a Chinese state-owned company is building or renovating a certain port, that the sovereignty of the country where that port is being built basically counts for nothing. So it is, as if the argument has often been put that the port of Hambantota was essentially Sri Lanka giving up its national sovereignty over Hambantota to China. But that's actually incorrect because when push comes to shove, it's the Sri Lankan authorities who have the sovereignty over that particular port. Okay. Now, in terms of ports which actually could have some strategic value, Karachi, the port of Gwadar, would be the one which potentially could be used in a situation of, say, prospective conflict right now. But even then, if you look at the kind of specifics, the reports which have come out about this have largely been pushed by some people within the Pakistani military establishment who would like China to have a base in Pakistan as a way of balancing India. But I don't think that the Chinese, and this is kind of a long standing position that they have in terms of India-Pakistan's own wars, I don't think that they really want to be physically involved in that particular conflict, even if China and India have their own border spat at this moment in time ongoing. What happened a few years back was that China donated actually a couple of frigates to the Pakistani Navy, and those were actually positioned in Gwadar. And so again, the assumption was made that, well, China is now leveraging this particular investment, for security purposes, for a strategic purpose. But actually, those frigates were used to help protect the port of Gwadar and protect Chinese engineers and laborers working on the project there. Because as it's been documented, Chinese engineers and laborers have actually been targets in various parts of Pakistan building the CPEC. In Balochistan in particular, there have been, several murders and attempted murders on the engineers and the laborers working in that particular part of Pakistan. So there's no real hard evidence for now which would let us believe that the Maritime Silk Road Initiative in the Indian Ocean, is being rolled out for a strategic purpose. Perhaps the best example that I could give here, but again, it's only one example and it doesn't really hold a lot of weight, is going back to 2014, when the Sri Lankan authorities allowed a Chinese submarine to dock in Colombo without giving prior warning to their Indian counterparts. Now, India and Sri Lanka have this kind of understanding whereby if any foreign naval vessel was to dock in a port in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankans would inform their Indian counterparts. But in this case, they did not. So this could be interpreted as the Sri Lankans essentially coming under the leverage of the Chinese and favoring China's strategic interests over India's strategic interests. But it's only really one relatively small example. Now that's China's rolling out of the Maritime Silk Road Initiative for strategic purposes. This does not comprise the responses which others have put in place to counterbalance China in the Indian Ocean. So the Maritime Silk Road Initiative does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a kind of dynamic geopolitical area, which is the Indian Ocean. And so, of course, India, which is not a signatory to the Belt and Road Initiative, has been, kind of taking a more assertive stance, particularly since 2014, in fact, with Sri Lanka, with Maldives, with Mauritius, with Seychelles, trying to have a greater maritime presence in the Indian Ocean to make sure that, China gets a message loud and clear that even if China has strategic pretensions, via the rollout of the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, India will be there in a way to push back. Now, India cannot propose a kind of direct competitor to the Maritime Silk Road Initiative because it doesn't have the same package that China can offer in terms of financing, in terms of expertise, in terms of companies which are, are kind of world leaders in building infrastructure. But it does have other means to influence countries in its neighborhood to make sure that China's influence doesn't grow to be too strong in that regard. And I think that this has been a real wake-up call for the Indian strategic community. But I think that they've responded quite well to that. And now you can see that some of the other big players, United States, the European Union, Canada, Australia, Japan, have also started to kind of put more emphasis on infrastructure financing, infrastructure development. Also because they want to have a rival, a kind of a working rival to the BRI, but also because they fear that the BRI could translate into growing Chinese influence in a part of the world which is important. Let's not forget that this is the maritime gateway to the Malacca Straits in Southeast Asia, where the bulk of trade between Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe traverses. So, of course, it's not just about countries in the Indo-Pacific. It can go beyond, who have a keen interest in making sure that they can also attempt to balance China in that regard.
Benjamin, you paint very beautiful picture in Indo-Pacific. Let me ask about how have China's main competitors in the Indo-Pacific, such as US, Japan, Australia, and India, responded to the rollout of the BRA, MSRA, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of these responses?
Yeah. I would start by saying that their response, I think, has been slow. And this kind of comes back to some of the points that we've touched upon already. The BRI was initially launched in 2013, as I mentioned. And I think that it took a long time for kind of China's main rivals or kind of systemic competitors to really appreciate the extent of course, as I also mentioned earlier, at first in China, I think there wasn't such a clear-cut vision as there is now on what was the One Belt, One Road. So there was the maritime section was supposed to be Southeast Asia. The land routes were supposed to reincarnate the old Silk routes, so Central Asia moving into the Middle East. I don't think that at first the Chinese leadership had such a kind of holistic view that East Africa, West Africa, Europe, Central America, Latin America would all become part of this kind of greater plan, if you like. So it took a while for the United States, for the EU, for Japan, Australia to really figure out what was meant by this. But when they saw the extent to which China was willing to bankroll these projects, when they saw, I think, how committed the Chinese leadership was to this, because I think this also reflects upon President Xi's own legacy in a way, then that's when they started to, I think, pay closer attention to this. Now, the responses have been variegated, poorly coordinated, I would say. So now you've got kind of various initiatives being put forward, like the B3W, Build Back Better, which is kind of loose coalition between Western actors. You've got some kind of ad hoc cooperation between the United States, the EU, and Canada. You've got the United Kingdom looking at where it's going to position itself in all this. And I would say that probably the most successful and perhaps least visible actor in this regard has been the Japanese, and through the Asian Development Bank. Now, the reason for this is because a lot of Western countries, the reason why they were so slow to respond is that, first of all, they really stopped doing large-scale infrastructure financing. So if we go back to the early 2000s, when Chinese companies were building football stadiums or parliaments in Africa, Western governments or civil society groups or think tanks, I think they were looking down upon the Chinese. They're building these infrastructure projects which have very little developmental value. And it's true. I mean, ultimately, a football stadium doesn't help people get jobs in the long term, or it doesn't help a country rise out of poverty. So they stopped doing large-scale infrastructure financing because it was seen as too risky, financially risky, politically risky, because sometimes it meant supporting a dictator, who might then abuse human rights, not respect the rule of law, go against Western political values, and so on and so forth. And also, infrastructure projects often require long-term financing, and can sometimes the success rate is not particularly high. So long-term financing means a certain amount of commitment, and maybe if there's a change of government in a Western country, they no longer want to support these kind of projects. So in a way, what this fetish, if you like, for infrastructure financing had been pushed by the wayside, and what Western governments were promoting through the kind of Washington Consensus was a market-driven approach to development. Okay, so that's why subsidies for big projects were not really favored so much, and this kind of state-led development economic policy was not really seen favorably. So what the United States and France and Britain and Germany would prefer to do is actually use the World Bank and the IMF to finance, and other multilateral banks or commercial banks to finance these kind of projects. So that's where, in a way, it created a void which China filled with its expertise through its companies, its engineers, its laborers, its policy banks, who had all garnered their own expertise in helping to develop China's own infrastructure on China's eastern seaboard, which is what served as a kind of foundation for China's own economic miracle. So that's why they were so late to the party, if you like, because in kind of Western kind of political economy thinking, subsidizing big infrastructure projects was not really something which they wanted to do. Okay, but now they realize, as you've alluded to in your question, that infrastructure financing is not just about development; it's also about politics, geopolitics, grand strategy. So there's been a response, and I think it's been quite visible now under the Biden administration, of a desire to offer a alternative. Now, what does this alternative involve? It's the aim is to kind of try and develop something which is going to attract the countries in the southern hemisphere who need infrastructure financing and construction, but attract them with a different kind of model, a model which is going to favor perhaps more sustainable financing and is not going to risk debt traps. It's going to put forward projects which are more environmentally friendly, socially friendly, and which are perhaps better in line with the sustainability, social, economic, political, financial of the so-called recipient countries. So that's what the EU, the United States, Australia, and Japan are trying to play up. It's this kind of alternative based on different values, but which can be as efficient as the BRI. So for now, this has been a lot of talk. We haven't actually seen what this means in practice. I think that the EU, the US are still trying to figure out exactly how this is going to be rolled out. And not only are they late to the party by a good decade, they simply do not have the kind of tools which China can offer through the BRI. And again, repeating what I've said already, they don't have this kind of bulk financing, kind of state banks which can offer low interest rates because they're subsidized by the Chinese government. They don't have big state-owned companies who are specialized in large-scale infrastructure projects. They don't have this kind of pool of labor, of human resource, which can be moved from one country to the next. I mean, Western expatriates don't want to work on infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America. It's a fact. And if they did, they would be too expensive to hire. Whereas, Chinese workforce can work 24 hours a day in shifts of 8 hours, for relatively low pay with precarious contracts, and they're happy to actually move around wherever the work is. So that's the reality that I think that China's competitors face today, is that they're going to have to think really hard about how they can offer something concrete, something competitive, something which can allow for kind of constructing infrastructure projects quickly, rapidly, because that's what the developing countries or emerging economies want. They want something which can be built in 3 years, in 5 years, not 10, 15, 20, 25 years, where there's lots of bureaucracy involved, where there's kind of too much administrative requirements. That's what they want to avoid. So it's going to be interesting looking forward to see whether they're actually capable of living up to some of this kind of grandiose rhetoric and the promises of offering a real alternative to the BRI. But for the time being, I just don't see it.
Benjamin, when we look at the current landscape in Indo-Pacific region, is it possible to say the US and its alliance countries firstly prioritizing the military activities than the infrastructure?
Yes, well, I would say to a large extent, yes. Of course, because that's where the United States has an obvious advantage. I mean, first of all, when China opened its one and only base in Djibouti in 2017, I mean, the ruckus it caused on social media and the press and in kind of conservative American or Western thinking and political parties and the like, they were, China had to tread very carefully in its public relations campaign to promote this base as something which was benign, right? But let's not forget, the Americans have something close to 800 bases around the world. Most of those are situated in the Indo-Pacific. So obviously, no one can compete against the Americans in that regard, and that gives the United States such an advantage in terms of mobilizing troops and resources, which China I don't think could ever aspire to. You can see, when I'm talking about Guada and the possibility of a Chinese naval base there, it's too political. There's too much controversy surrounding it, but no one takes, criticizes the American presence because it's long-standing, it's ingrained. It goes back to the Cold War, to the Second World War. It's there, and it's not really being questioned. Also, because a number of countries in the Indo-Pacific rely upon that, to provide their security umbrella, going back all the way to Japan, the Republic of Korea, and also Taiwan. So the hubs and spokes model, which underpins American primacy in the Asia Pacific, its added value is very much still reliant upon the security dimension today. The economic part, which allowed for the reconstruction of Japan and South Korea, and Taiwan, and others in Southeast Asia, that element is kind of largely been eroded, particularly after the global financial crisis, when in 2009 China became the number one trade partner for pretty much every country in the Indo-Pacific, and the United States can no longer really offer what China can offer from a trade perspective. Now, investment is slightly different, because if we look at levels of investment in countries comprising the Indo-Pacific, the United States, Japan, and the EU still largely beat China in terms of the volume of investments. But the trends are, of course, altering and are moving in China's favor. As time goes on, China is essentially closing that gap. So, with regards to infrastructure, well, of course, trade and investment for China in the Indo-Pacific has gone hand in hand with infrastructure investments, and that's also because in China there's not only just this comparative advantage, which I've kind of repeated time and again in our talk this evening, but also Chinese companies, Chinese infrastructure companies essentially want to find markets overseas because that own market in China has become saturated. So they need to develop these niche markets overseas, and they have the support of the government to do that. And that's why they've been able to roll out the BRI in the way that they have. So, yes, in a way, the West, led by the United States in the Indo-Pacific, has to play to its strength, and its strength is definitely from a military perspective, even though, of course, China is also closing the gap there to a certain extent, I would say, maybe particularly on the naval dimension, but in other areas, I'm not so sure that China has really caught up to kind of American supremacy from a military perspective. And also China simply does not have anywhere near the network of allies which the United States can count upon in the Indo-Pacific.
Yes. So I'm going to ask another question. What are the prospects and strategic implications moving forward for the MSRI and BRA in Indo-Pacific? What will be your take on this question?
Yeah, I think that as we move forward in the short term, the medium term, let's say the next, kind of 5 to 20 years, I think that there's going to be a more conservative take on the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, which is ultimately going to hinder China's ability to express strategic influence in the Indo-Pacific and in the Indian Ocean region. The reason for this is, again, coming back to the point I mentioned to one of your earlier questions, simply that I think that at first there was such enthusiasm connected to the BRI that perhaps there was not sufficient scrutiny on some of the terms of the financing of some BRI and MSRI projects. Some BRI and MSRI projects, I think, were poorly chosen, and that's because they were largely pushed by the recipient, the so-called recipient or BRI countries, as they're called and referenced today. And also, as mentioned in China, there is an economic slowdown ongoing. I don't think the Chinese government can really afford to have such largesse as it did over the past 8 years now. So that's going to be fewer projects in number. Now, it might mean that there's going to be better projects in terms of the quality of these projects, which might kind of make up for the lower number of projects and the kind of diminished number, the diminishing financing associated to the BRI and the MSRI looking forward. But my prediction is that China will take a more conservative view over these projects, and that they're going to, I think, be more stringent, and the Chinese policy banks are going to be less are going to be more risk averse in terms of just kind of financing projects willy-nilly as they have in the past. We've also seen that some projects have kind of almost collapsed. So I mentioned earlier the port project of Bagamoyo in Tanzania, which is supposed to be a $10 billion super mega port in East Africa. It was going to become the biggest port in the region, the next Dubai, if you like, the next Rotterdam. And that collapsed under the leadership of the former Tanzanian president, John Magufuli, who pushed the project almost to the brink. It's not completely dead in the water, but it's on hold for now. So I think that element is also going to, the kind of domestic politics of recognition in BRI countries that perhaps the Belt and Road Initiative is not such a panacea as it was at the beginning, that there are risks involved, and that sometimes the projects simply are not perhaps worth it as they might have been, 10 years ago. And the third element, I think, which is going to have an impact on China's ability to exert strategic, it's kind of the rollout of its own grand strategy and its strategicness in Indo-Pacific is the resistance met by third parties, by India in the Indian Ocean, by the United States through various initiatives, by Japan, by the European Union, and even perhaps by some of the countries in and along the Maritime Silk Road itself. So again, highlighting examples like the elections in Maldives in 2018, in Sri Lanka in 2015. I think that it's going to take a lot for China to aspire to kind of leverage the Maritime Silk Road and the BRI in the same way that it has over the past 8 years. I think there are a lot more obstacles for China to overcome in that regard, both domestically and in terms of the external environment. So I'm not optimistic for China in that regard.
Okay, thank you very much, Benjamin.
You're welcome.
It's really, I enjoyed, and I believe that my audiences also enjoyed this such a great conversation.
Thanks again for inviting me.
You are welcome, and also thank you for audiences they have been with us until now and watching us. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and share our videos. See you in the next shows.